As I travel through the Cosmere, I can't help but be amazed by the achievements of those who came before me. Those who set the groundwork, allowing us to traverse all of these realms. I'm most fascinated and impressed by the concept of Worldhoppers, people who travel between worlds. In this video, I'll be talking about how world hopping is done, the different methods that exist in the Cosmere, technological, magical, and otherwise, as well as the role that the cognitive realm and other magics play in traversing the Cosmere. There won't be many story spoilers in this video, but where I can't avoid them, I will provide a timestamp for where to skip to. Also be specifically sensitive to Wind and Truth, as well as some unreleased works that I'll be discussing.
I'll be sourcing information from the following books: Yumi and the Nightmare Painter, The Sunlit Man, Tress of the Emerald Sea, Elantris, The Stormlight Archive, The Bands of Mourning, The Lost Metal, and a little bit from Wind and Truth. And the previews for Isles of the Emberdark, but just the stuff that was read in 2020. The term world hopping is pretty straightforward. It is the process of traveling from one planet to another in the Cosmere. There are a variety of ways to do this, and some methods are easier and more accessible than others, but every method is still a form of world hopping. Those who world hop are called Worldhoppers, and for the most part, it's done through organized means, whether that be trade networks, scholarly groups, or other factions. It's not required to be part of a group in order to world hop, but given the difficulty, danger, and demand for interplanetary commerce, world hopping as part of a group is definitely a trend.
I world hop to study the Cosmere. I'm able to do this with the assistance and patronage of a wealthy draconic donor in Silverlight on behalf of the 17th Shard. But if you wanted to support the channel and become one of my wealthy draconic donors, you can. Channel memberships are now live. Just hit the join button if you want to support me and help me make cool things. Thanks. For most of the Cosmere's history, world hopping was something done in the background. Very few people knew that traveling between the stars was possible, and even fewer did it. For example, in Mistborn Era 1, there was an entire network of trade onto Scadrial through Ruin's Perpendicularity. That was, of course, before the pits got vandalized.
"Got stuck there, did you?" the man said. "In 80s prison." He clicked his tongue. "Fitting recompense for what you did. Poetic even. What I did? Destroying the pits, oh scarred one. That was the only perpendicularity on this planet with any reasonable ease of access. This one is very dangerous, growing more so by the minute, and difficult to find. By doing what you did, you basically ended traffic through Scadrial, upended an entire mercantile ecosystem, which I'll admit was fun to watch." The oldest and most established method for world hopping is by using a perpendicularity to transfer between realms. A perpendicularity is a point where a lot of investiture pools together. This concentration of investiture makes a singularity of sorts, a point where all three realms are pierced and transition between them is possible.
These points are usually associated with a shard, but don't necessarily require one. However, every world that has a shard actively investing it does have a pool associated with that shard, at least somewhere on world, even if it's not in like a fixed location. Oftentimes, these pools of investiture are literal pools, places where liquid investiture coalesces and realmatic transfers possible. People would enter these pools and they would transfer from either the physical realm to the cognitive or cognitive to the physical to continue on their journeys.
Shards have some influence over where these pools appear, but other times they simply form in places where the fabric of the universe makes it easier. Are shards limited to one per perpendicularity? Can a non-splintered shard control where and how their perpendicularity manifests? Raffo, but yes on the second. Investiture exists in three main stages or phases: solid, liquid, and gas, although it has been observed in a plasma-like state in at least one location. Every example of a stable perpendicularity we know of takes the form of a pool, liquid investiture. Power that pools and coalesces in specific places on planets that shards have invested. There are known stable perpendicularities on Scadrial, Nalthis, Groshar, and Cell.
With the exception of Cell, these worlds have stable, reliable access to interplanetary contact, and are among some of the oldest world-hopping civilizations that we know of. Taldane, the homeworld of the Shard autonomy, might also have a stable perpendicularity. However, we know that she's preventing people from coming on and off worlds, so she might have blockaded it, might have temporarily closed it, but we really just don't know at this time. But there are places in the Cosmere where investiture pools enough to create one of these points naturally.
The most well-known naturally occurring perpendicularity is located on the planet First of the Sun on the island of Patji. Here, wild, formerly unclaimed investiture coalesced to form a stable perpendicularity. This pool, and Patji itself, have been co-opted by the Shard autonomy and are now avatars of her power.
That said, there is still some speculation about whether or not this perpendicularity existed before Patji was made into an avatar.
As you've stated that the magic on First of the Sun is natural and independent of any particular shard, what is the nature of the pool on Patji? Is it also a natural manifestation of magic, a perpendicularity, or simply a pool like any other? It's a natural manifestation, but on a much smaller scale than you might find on other worlds.
Speaking of autonomy, we learned something interesting about both her and Perpendicularities in the book The Lost Metal. If you don't want spoilers for that book, skip to this timestamp right here.
Near the end of The Lost Metal, Autonomy and her army of Gold and Red are preparing to invade Scadrial by making a realmatic transition from the cognitive realm to the physical realm.
In Mistborn Era 2, Harmony's Perpendicularity is located south of the basin, likely in the Malwish Consortium. I think this for two reasons. Helsier kind of says he has to go south to get to the Perpendicularity, and also they have access to Et Metal. And if you know anything about how Ruin's God Metal forms, Et Metal makes a lot of sense there. Also, fun little aside, in the Worldhopper passport from Dragonsteel Nexus 2024, the Scadrial stamp says Perpendicularity of Harmony when you get the stamp for going through customs. So that's just a fun little nod. But anyway, back to Autonomy. Instead of marching her troops south to Harmony's Perpendicularity, she decides to create her own perpendicularity by pooling liquefied investiture. Eventually, she pools enough in one place that it weakens the barrier between realms and essentially forms an artificial perpendicularity.
But how does transferring to the cognitive realm allow people to visit other worlds? Unlike the physical realm, where planets are separated by the void of space, the cognitive realm is essentially a flat plane. The geography of the physical realm is inverted in this dimension. What was land is a water equivalent, and what was water is land. At least, that's how it's been observed to work on Scadrial and Roshar. Additionally, distance in the cognitive realm is compressed, especially in the vertical direction. Urithiru was high in the mountains, and they needed to hike down to sea level. Strangely, Shallan told him that they'd done measurements, and the path wasn't nearly as long as it would be in the physical realm. Space wasn't a one-to-one correlation in Shadesmar. Things seemed more compressed here, specifically in the vertical dimension. Izasek the mapmaker thought the place was incredible for reasons Adolin hadn't been able to grasp, despite having it explained to him 3 times.
The less people think about a place, the more compressed it is in the cognitive realm. For this reason, the distance between planets is greatly diminished because people can't really fathom the distance between planets. This perception of space from people in the physical realm is the backbone of how travel in the Cosmere works. Without this compression of space-time in the cognitive realm, traveling between planets would be almost impossible. It continues to be the backbone of interplanetary travel all the way up till the advent of FTL.
Is it the center of the Cosmere?
Can I just do it?
There isn't a center of the Cosmere.
It's just like the real universe. Everything looks like the center from where
I
you
keep
are.
calling it a dwarf galaxy, but I think they decided it's a cluster instead of a dwarf galaxy. Why did...
Even a dwarf galaxy is still really...
Yeah, it's still too big, so we had to call it cluster. Yeah, because we only wanted, like, what? We came up with, like, 50, 100 stars. Yeah. So it's a cluster. Or really dwarf galaxy.
Yeah.
A distance of what we assume to be multiple light years can be traversed in weeks or months by venturing through the cognitive realm. You can think of it a bit like the Nether in Minecraft. 8 blocks in the overworld is 1 in the Nether, so you can cut the time it takes to travel from point A to point B in your Minecraft world by using a nether portal and popping out at another portal at your destination. There's still a distance to cross in the cognitive realm, but it's much smaller than the space between the planets in the physical realm.
Assuming you can access the cognitive realm, this is really the only viable way to travel in the Cosmere, at least to other planets. But it does have its limitations. You're only able to travel to places that have a perpendicularity unless you're able to manually make a realmatic transition. These very few stable perpendicularities are choke points. And as such, they're vital to the security of planets that are aware of Worldhoppers. Some planets have customs, others have blockades, but regardless, these known choke points are very important.
Lotus says, if one was world hopping to Nalthis, what type of customs would they have to go through?
Nalthis customs. I mean, there'll be some tariffs to pay depending on what's going on. I mean, it is kind of not that different from what you would imagine. What I have read about in sort of Renaissance times, like, you know, pay your fees, things like that. But it's not really something I have to worry about. Quarantines because of the disease factor. It's just not on their radar for the reasons I've explained. You don't have to worry about that. Like dangerous items, like what sort of dangerous items are you talking about, right? I do think they try to prevent people with breaths from leaving the planet, particularly lots of them. If you getting off, I would say, is a little more tricky because they do not want the breath bleed of investiture leaving their planet, but I think you will find some notable examples of it happening, so they are not impossible to dodge those customs.
Even on Roshar, cultivation's perpendicularity can be blockaded, and presumably the Unkalaki have legends and traditions about who they let in. There are other places that you can go on Roshar to get between Shadesmar and the physical realm, primarily the Oathgates. However, the limiting factor there is you have to have a willing Oathgate Spren, a living blade, and investiture to power the realmatic transition. If you don't have these three things, you're stuck.
Oathgates appear to be a modified version of something called an Elsgate. They're large fabrials created with the cooperation of two modified Inkspren to mechanically use the surge of transportation. This does make it possible to transfer between realms at an Oathgate platform, but as I mentioned earlier, it does come with its own set of challenges.
Another vulnerability is one of supplies. There's not food and water in the cognitive realm, so you're limited to what you bring with you or what you're able to trade for.
Thankfully, at least in the Rasharan subastral, Spren settlements usually have some imported canned food and barrels of water available for trade.
At that point, it's a question of whether or not the Worldhopper has access to the right currency or is able to make a trade with the Spren in the cognitive realm. Other invested worlds don't have access to a stable perpendicularity or a perpendicularity at all, and have become relatively isolated until the advent of space travel in the Cosmere. This includes some worlds where a shard used to be present but is no longer present. These worlds have access to investiture, but not really a good way to travel on and off world until space travel. This includes planets like Ashen, Canticle, Komashi, Lumar, and Threnody for that matter. Traveling through the cognitive realm isn't the only way to world hop in the Cosmere, and it may become less effective as time goes on. But as of current continuity, which I consider to be the end of Lost Metal and the end of Wind and Truth, it is still the most effective way to travel between worlds. Even though recently we've seen glimpses of what world hopping and interplanetary travel look like in the future of the Cosmere, through the glimpses we've seen in Tress of the Emerald Sea, Yumi and the Nightmare Painter, and the Sunlit Man.
Additionally, the Cosmere has access to exotic and energy-dense materials in the form of invested arts and raw investiture. Access to these materials should help space travel and even FTL travel develop rather quickly.
I'm going to rapid fire through different methods of space travel we've seen in the Cosmere. If we know how they work, be it magic or otherwise, I will give brief mention to it, but otherwise I will just move on. The section will contain slight spoilers for the Sunlit Man, Yumi and the Nightmare Painter, Six of the Dusk, and explicit story spoilers for Tress of the Emerald Sea. So if you don't want those, skip here.
In Tress of the Emerald Sea, the sorceress lives in a tower on the Midnight Sea. This sorceress is actually an off-worlder Elantrian, and her tower is actually a spaceship. Specifically, a rocket. Not much is known about how this rocket works. We're not sure if it's powered by investiture, Aeon Door, or another type of conventional fuel source. We do know that there's an AI, presumably an awakened machine of some sort, called Seslo. Seslo helps control the vessel, so there's at least some magic helping the ship's operations.
The ship's hulls are also etched in aeons, but it's not super clear if those are providing light like they do on the walls of the city of Elantris. I would say they probably don't, because the lighting in there is described as very like hospital or office building like, and that doesn't seem like Elantris magic lighting to me, but I could be wrong.
Zephyr spores might also be important for space travel in the future of the Cosmere. They could serve as an emergency air supply or a dense source of air to use as a propellant in space. Regardless, I think that the Zephyr Sea on Lumar will prove to be a valuable resource in the Cosmere space age, even though the planet itself is a bit of a backwater. Next up, we've got the Space Bus from Yumi and the Nightmare Painter. I find this spacecraft kind of funny because it works the same way that normal cars and buses do on Komashi, just this one goes up. All advanced technology on Komashi is powered by Heon, lines of cyan and magenta power that come from the ground provided by or sourced by the spirits. This craft functions by riding on strengthened Heon lines into space. These lines are connected to the surface of the planet and are somehow extended out into the space between Komashi and Utah. It seems more like a space elevator to me that's tied to the surface of the planet but can be maneuvered. Presumably, its range is further than just Komashi to the planet Utah, because at the end of the book, Hoyd steals this ship and one similar to it and travels to something called Iron 7 Way Station, presumably a Scadrian space station.
There are at least 3 books with references to Scadrians being a spacefaring people, but we still don't know how their ships operate. I do have some ideas though, so stay tuned. On Canticle in the book The Sunlit Man, there's also a ship of Scadrian researchers from a group called the Time Tellers. We're not entirely sure what powers their ship or how it functions, but they do have an AI of sorts, an awakened steel mind they call it, that either powers the ship or dictates its operations. I'm more inclined to think that it dictates operations. I'm also not sure why steel is the metal used. It's an awakened steel mind AI. Wouldn't a copper mind that stores information make more sense? The only reason I could imagine it being made of steel is if it has to do with how the ship moves around. If it is an awakened steel mind that stores speed when it's not moving, that's later used in travel when it moves. I don't think it would be quite FTL technology, because how could you store enough speed and then tap it to move faster than light, but it's still an interesting idea.
Also on Canticle, we see local vessels powered by sun hearts. These invested objects provide an energy-dense power source, which makes achieving flight easier. One of the bottlenecks in spaceflight is that the more fuel you have to power your craft, the more fuel you need just to compensate for the weight of that same fuel.
It's likely that an invested power source, or even something like Zephyr Aether Spores, would help alleviate this bottleneck. In our world, up to 80 and 90% of the weight on a spacecraft at time of the ignition is the fuel source required to get that into the air in the first place. With an energy-dense invested fuel source, it's likely that you could do much better than the fuel sources that we have today. And if you want to learn more about Canticle and Sun Hearts, I do have a video about that. There'll be a card in the corner here if you want to learn more. As a bit of an aside, in The Sunlit Man, when the Scadrians ask Nomad to continue the conversation in a civilized language, they ask if they can continue in Malwish, which I think is super interesting and a bit of an indicator that things don't go very well for the Ellendale Basiners if the predominant language the spacefaring Scadrians use is Malwish. The Scadrians are inhibited somewhat in their exploration endeavors by a set of laws. We've seen this twice, once in The Sunlit Man and also in the Isles of the Emberdark previews. They seemingly also have laws governing first contact, and when they're able to contact a civilization after a certain technological level is reached.
There he leaned forward and spoke in a loud voice. Under the Refugee and Lost Expatriate Bill of Silverlight Codes of Interplanetary Conduct, I formally request asylum in this facility. Please respond. One of the few things we know about the future of the spacefaring Cosmere is that there is a multi-planetary conflict going on between Roshar and Scadrial, with other planets picking sides, attempting to stay neutral, or trying to assert themselves as galactic superpowers. We'll just have to wait and see how these sides take shape, what causes the conflict, and how these laws are crafted and enforced.
The next section will have information from the Isles of the Emberdark preview. If you don't want those spoilers specifically, skip here. There will also be minor story spoilers for Wind and Truth. If you don't want those, you should avoid this section or skip to this timestamp.
In the Isles of the Emberdark preview, we see a glowing figure in radiant shard plate descend from the sky and talk about the laws. In all but name, this is a Radiant who speaks with rhythm and glows with an interesting light. The implication about him being interested in laws is that he's a Skybreaker, kind of sent as a countermeasure to what the Scadrians are trying to do. Another implication of this is that Radiants of the Fourth Ideal, whether they be Windrunners or Skybreakers, are able to use their armor as a spacesuit of sorts, and able to lash themselves between planets.
The use of the surges is another way that people can world hop. Elseschallers can transition between the realms, but they also might have access to something called an Elsgate. Elsgates are portals working off the surge of transportation. We haven't seen them used very much, but an Elsgate powered by a bondsmithing was used to get people from Ashen to Roshar. Navani had known what to expect. It was another thing entirely to witness it. The portal started small, a pinprick in the sky, then spread wide by the efforts of a man who stood on the other side. At least she thought he was the source, because he stood with arms stretched wide, a look of concentration on his face as if forcibly pushing the portal open. Ishar, Dalinar said. Ishi the Herald, it's him, younger. His hair was white by the time I met him, but that is him. This figure wore a simple blue robe tied at the waist and had a beard that had barely started to gray. He strained to hold the way open as thousands of refugees flooded around him, clutching their meager possessions, leading withered animals, many of which were unfamiliar to Navani. In the background, their world burned. The very sky seemed to be on fire, and the people were covered in ash and soot. Navani felt a sudden need to go comfort them. She glanced at the portal, which had expanded to 30 feet in diameter. Ishar stood in the center, hands thrust to the side, his face a mask of concentration as he let thousands escape the burning land. They wore a variety of clothing styles, and were of many ethnicities. They must have gathered together at the end, seeking refuge from the fires.
Anyone with access to enough power, connection, and the surge of transportation should theoretically be able to teleport to other worlds. Using an Elsgate to travel, even on the same planet in the same realm that you're in, seems to require a lot of investiture. We also don't see Elsgates used very often, and there's gotta be a reason for this. Whether that's one of power or one of knowledge is unclear.
Elantrians using the surge of transportation via Aeontia could theoretically use Aeondor to world hop to another planet. This is an incredibly risky way to travel. The use of Aeontia requires exact measurements of distance, inclination, and other modifiers.
If an Elantrian were to get something wrong with their Aeonic equation, things could go bad very quickly. They could teleport themselves into the planet's crust, into the vacuum of space, or just miss the mark completely and teleport themselves into the cognitive or spiritual realms. It's possible, but I imagine it would be very difficult. Faster-than-light travel capabilities was baked into Allomancy, although how it's going to be done is not entirely clear. There is a lot of speculation on this, but one of my favorites is an Allomantic Alcubierre drive using Harmonium.
This is a theoretical warping of space to create a bubble around a craft. The underlying principle is that Allomantic external temporal metals, Bendelay and cadmium, push and pull on space-time. If these were boosted with one side of the bubble pushing on space-time and the other pulling, you could theoretically achieve faster-than-light travel by moving the space around the ship faster than light. Nothing in the universe is able to move faster than the speed of light, but space itself can.
We've seen this to some extent at the end of the Lost Metal, when Bandelloy and Duralium were burned at the same time, creating a speed bubble that was so powerful that the person inside was able to effectively move faster than light. Light wasn't able to get in, and the only way they were able to see was by using steel sight.
However, people have asked Brandon about this idea, and here's what he had to say. So would it be possible to use steel running plus compounding to travel FTL? No, it would not. You would get close, though. Kind of like Zemo's paradox, then. You keep having the distance, never quite making it, gleam in his eye. Trying to crack Allomantic FTL? Maybe. You can't. I don't know, there's a lot of good theories out there. It involves Allomantic abilities which we don't know about yet, and this was in 2014. When asked a similar question, Peter Ahlstrom, editorial director at Dragonsteel, had this to say. So I was thinking about how the third trilogy was mentioned as being in the future, and I wondered if there were people from Scadrial who would be able to visit other shard worlds without using Shadesmar, and if so, how would they do it? The simplest method would be FTL travel. But then I got thinking about pulsars and sliders. My first thought was, hey, what if a bunch of pulsars and some pulsar-inspired technology could put a bubble around the crew quarters of a starship that would allow the crew to travel from one system to another within their own lifetime. Just put the ship on autopilot, power up the pulsar engine, and go have a sandwich. Then I tried to figure out if something similar might work for sliders, but the first bump I hit was that Bandelloy bubbles and cadmium bubbles were stationary, which in turn would probably rule out a pulsar starship. But then I thought some more. These books take place in a universe which is astronomically pretty much like our own. It follows the same rules of physics, which means that Scadrial is rotating on its axis while it revolves around its star, while that star moves within its galaxy and that galaxy moves within its universe. Which means technically, Bandelloy and cadmium bubbles aren't stationary. They're stationary relative to one object, Scadrial, but they're perfectly mobile when one looks at the bigger picture. That makes me think that a pulsar starship might be possible, provided that pulsing can be anchored to the ship rather than Scadrial. So it makes me wonder, why the default anchor is the planet and why nobody's figured out how to anchor it elsewhere? Is it simply a mental block that could be overcome? Is a person too small to be used as an anchor? Can a bubble's size be altered dependent upon the size of its anchor? I still dig the idea of Allomansters in space, though I'm not entirely sure how it would work. Then Peter Ahlstrom says, there's an issue with conservation of momentum within speed bubbles. And finally, we know that FTL capabilities were baked into Allomancy, whether that's through speed bubbles, steel compounding, or something else.
Before that Mistborn was going to be 3 trilogies.
85. It'll be 3 trilogies, yes.
It's going to so the technology advancing, so like tracking.
Yes, the FTL is built into the magic systems, and so there will be something where they figure out how to do that with the magic, and spaceships will be propelled using that.
Awesome.
Expanding bubbles around the engines and
You will see.
on the ships.
You will see.
Someone on site actually
Figured it out.
has a very convincing theory.
They're missing a very big, important piece of the puzzle that you won't get for a few more books.
As conventional space travel becomes a more reliable form of world hopping, this might destabilize world hopping through the cognitive realm. As people travel and explore the vastness of space, their concept of the distances between planets becomes more quantified. This might result in the cognitive realm actually expanding a bit and the distances between planets becoming greater. However, this won't lead to a full-on collapse. Brandon has made it very clear that because humans can't really fathom the vastness of space, it's still going to be more compressed than going through the physical realm, but there might be some warping.
Buffasasa says, if everyone in the Cosmere begins to understand that there is space travel, does that change the distance needed to travel around in Shadesmar, considering it's made up of the beliefs of the people?
What's going to happen is it is going to make the travel distances longer. However, people cannot conceive the immensity of space. And the amount different it's going to make it is not going to be so vast that it's insurmountable. It's not going to come one, fractional piece of what the actual distance is.
The last method for world hopping I'd like to talk about is called skipping. Skipping is a new concept in the Cosmere, and only holders of a certain Dawn Shard are known to be able to do this.
Skipping allows someone with sufficient connection and 20,000 BEUs of investiture to instantaneously teleport to another place in the Cosmere where investiture is present. The only character known to possess this ability is Nomad.
It's unclear if holders of other Dawn Shards would be able to skip as well, but this is mostly because we don't know if other Dawn Shards connect their holder in the same way to the greater Cosmere. Hoyd, a former Dawn Shard / current Dawn Shard, depends on when you're reading, can't skip for some reason.
Hi, I'm Robin. Is there a specific reason as to why Hoyd cannot skip, but Nomad can?
Yes, there is a specific reason for that. I'll get into it someday. Let's just say the skipping started because of a certain event that, probably I won't write a book to talk about, but you will get an answer to that someday, I hope. So it's a RAFO, but a RAFO with a little bit of a promise.
Whether this is an issue of knowledge or connection or just hasn't been developed yet is unclear. We just know he can't do it. What is clear, though, that getting around the Cosmere, even after conventional space travel exists, is perilous. I haven't even mentioned theories for how Rosharans are going to achieve FTL. Is it with Fabrials utilizing gravity spread? That's just a theory, but I don't know. How do you think Rosharan magic systems could be used to create FTL? But one of the funnest things about the Cosmere is that the magic physics can be pushed so far. It's really the sky's the limit, or beyond, I guess, for your level of theorizing for how things work. Come to think of it, I haven't even mentioned cross-cultural communication and trade in the Cosmere. That could be an entirely different video. But the ramifications of these vastly different cultures being able to communicate with each other is incredible. But unfortunately, I'm out of time. I have an appointment back on Scadrial with a harmonics expert, so I will see you guys next time. If you enjoyed the video, be sure to like and subscribe, and share this with all your friends who enjoy the Cosmere. And as always, have an excellent time of day. Thanks for watching. Bye.